All right, well, let's kick off today. Before we start, we have a word from our sponsor. This week's episode is brought to you by a fellow podcaster. So here's a word from our sponsor, Stay Sharp with Razorleaf.
Digital transformation is reshaping manufacturing, and leaders must keep up with a rapidly changing technology landscape. Razorleaf, a global consulting and systems integration firm, launched Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, a podcast covering digital thread, digital twins, PLM, MES, data integration, and more. Whether you're a seasoned professional or new to digital transformation, this podcast will help you stay ahead of the trends. You can find Stay Sharp with Razorleaf on all major podcast platforms. Tune in today.
We're back. And honestly, guys, if it's too chill, please let me know.
No, it's an interesting change of pace. I don't want to be critical of David because he'll come in here first thing and be like, "Sorry, I was so loud, Jeff." But it wasn't. It's not that. It's just different. That's all.
I mean, Anna, I can say out of my 2 podcast appearances, you are the best moderator I've seen on the Today in Manufacturing podcast and episodes that I have participated in.
Thanks, Nolan. 100% score on that one, huh?
Yep. Well done.
Appreciate that. All right, well, let's kick off with our first story this week. This is the 5th most popular story on our websites, and the title was Shuttered Kraft Heinz Factory to Become Cannabis Growing Facility. So a cannabis company has shared plans to open up a cannabis growing facility in a shuttered Kraft Heinz factory near Baltimore. MAS Alliance CEO Seth Murphy said his company is looking to build a 6,000 square foot growing space on the site by the end of the year, and there is plenty of room to expand. MAS Alliance, which received its license back in 2020, wants to specialize in boutique cannabis products and alternate versions of established cannabis strains. The company has already begun hiring for the cannabis cultivation operation and said it could eventually open a dispensary on or near the site. Kraft Heinz announced plans to close the site in 2015. The factory primarily produced croutons and employed 89 people. Jeff, what do you think about this story? We're seeing a factory be repurposed for an industry that seems to be growing. All good? Mixed bag? What do you think?
I think there's a lot of positive here. First of all, can you imagine how good this town must have smelled? Because I think this is where they did like the stuffing. The croutons and stuff were used in like the stuffing packages and stuff like that for the dressing. So how would you feel about smelling that all the time?
It was a stovetop factory?
That was I don't know if it was still, but that was the impression I got. The croutons were used primarily like in those those box dressing.
Do you remember the
products.
Commercial from forever ago when it's the kid and he pretends like he's eating dinner or at his friend's house, or there's something about how he manages to eat dinner twice because it's a stovetop stuffing night.
I do vaguely remember this.
2 separate
commercial.
homes.
Yes,
a bit of a stretch, but
anyway, coming off the holiday, that just kind of like resonated. Absolutely,
sure thing.
Again, a lot of positive here. I mean, obviously they're taking a vacant facility and bringing new life into it. And I think it's interesting on a couple of fronts. First of all, when you look at 6,000 square feet for an indoor growing, that's, I would say conservatively, that's about half the size of what you would typically see for these types of growth areas or growth businesses for cannabis. So that was interesting to see that they are starting small with the idea of going larger. So they're scaling up the business. It would seem to has a lot of practical elements to it in terms of how they're viewing the use of this facility. And with 125,000 feet available to them, there is a lot of room to grow, which makes sense a little bit too when you look at Maryland. And, you know, the cannabis processing side of things has been sort of a mixed bag. There's been some areas where it's been extremely successful. You look at Oregon, Colorado, California, very, very strong market there. This has been legal in Maryland for about a year. They did over $1 billion in retail business just in cannabis for both medical and recreational use within that year. So very impressive in terms of the way it's growing in this area. Obviously, it's a good market for it, and they're leveraging that and taking advantage of it with this facility. The other thing I think this underscores a little bit is other uses for a lot of these vacant industrial buildings, and that is urban agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's something that we do talk about from time to time, usually with these huge, very innovative indoor growing facilities for a lot of different stuff, but we're seeing more urban agriculture just being used in a very practical sense. I mean, cannabis, yes, it's a growth market, not something you'd think of automatically when you think about new farming initiatives, but it is growing and very popular here. And I think it does underscore, again, the fact that this is a way to use these facilities in ways that we haven't thought about before. Globally, urban farming is becoming responsible for, in some cases, 20 to 30% of that local food supply. So great way to tap into these resources. Hopefully others look into it as well. And, hopefully this business can make the most of this situation.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So Nolan, what did you think about this story?
Sorry. Oh my goodness. I'm so nervous. I thought it was a good example of transforming and repurposing a shuttered facility. A few years ago, I did a food and beverage tour in Virginia. It was a part of a work trip, and we toured a current winery that used to be an old Virginia metal crafters facility. And I wrote a story for our food site about how all the things they had to do to repurpose it. It was a lot of work. It was in a historic site, so they had to make sure corners weren't touched to preserve the history. They had to add a ramp on the floor so things could drain because wine's a liquid. And I just thought it was like an interesting way to repurpose. So what was it? It was a Heinz factory, and now it's cannabis.
It was a stovetop stuffing factory, according to Jeff. I may have taken that a little bit too far. It was a mainly crouton factory.
So it's a pretty big shift in industries.
Yeah.
From like food and beverage to the cannabis. The one question I did have was I was wondering how it was going to resonate with the residents around who, how are they going to handle with a facility changing from like traditional manufacturing or factory jobs to cannabis, which has its stigma, federally illegal, all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think sometimes the patchwork that we see with the legislation and regulation around cannabis is very problematic in that sense because it feels like sort of this transient thing for people. They're not sure if these rules are subject to change based on the whims of a different administration or what have you. Their governor comes in and doesn't,
Sure.
So, and I think the other thing to think about there too is just, if you want to enable this burgeoning industry to grow, some more clarity around that legislation, I think would be important just because, I think you would see more of this type of investment if companies felt secure enough to put down roots somewhere and say, hey, we're going to really do this.
That might be why he's starting at 6,000 square feet as opposed to a larger operation. Maybe it's to scale up. Maybe it's also because there is some of that uncertainty going forward with a new administration, with a lot of that sort of, like you said, Nolan, it's just not real clear between the federal government and the states and how that's going to play out in the long term. Feels like there's a lot of momentum going towards more of a national legalization and acceptance of cannabis on a recreational level. Mm-hmm. But we'll see what happens. As far as the surrounding area, it was interesting because even, we look at some of these closings and 90 people or 89 people doesn't always jump out at you. For this community, that was a huge hit when they lost these jobs. So even if tens of those come back, I think they're embracing that. And we haven't really heard too much about these cannabis processing facilities in terms of issues with the surrounding neighborhoods. Unless you're burning it, it's not going to have a smell or odor to it or anything like that. So I think there's been, over time, more embracing of what it can bring to the table.
For sure. And, more and more, as they poll people over time, more and more people are accepting of legalizing for certain applications or medical or even recreational. It's not as divisive as it was, even I would say 10, 15 years ago. So,
I'd agree.
But yes, I agree with you both on, to reuse shuttered factory space. We talk about these buildings sometimes, they fall into disrepair. They're very specific. And there's only so many high-end lofts that can be built or whatever,
only so many brew pubs that can support business.
Right. On the on top of an old factory, so often you see them fall into disrepair. They become blighted. Sometimes they require a lot of environmental remediation to even tear them down and get rid of them. So the last thing you want is that. So good to see, I think, this existing space be utilized. All right. Our next most popular story this week, emergency vehicle lights are giving driverless cars digital seizures. It's a lot to take in that sentence. I'll let you absorb that. All right. So while driverless systems are often capable of reacting to scenarios more safely than a human driver would, sometimes the opposite is true, as evidenced by crashes over the years where a vehicle in autonomous mode has missed a seemingly obvious hazard. Researchers from Ben Gurion University and Japanese tech company Fujitsu Limited have published a paper that suggests there may be a problem with how autonomous vehicle systems react to emergency vehicles, or specifically emergency vehicle lights. The study says that some camera-based automated systems can go a bit berserk when they observe the flashing lights of an emergency vehicle, and the researchers liken the reaction to a kind of digital epileptic seizure. Making it difficult to decipher what's ahead, this problem, the researchers say, is worse at night and creates significant risk the vehicles could crash. Perhaps even more alarming, they suggest that autonomous vehicles could be exploited by adversaries to cause such accidents. The research was reportedly inspired by 16 cases over a 4-year period where Teslas on autopilot collided with stationary emergency vehicles. That said, the researchers did not test their theory on Teslas, instead using aftermarket collision detection cameras. The NHTSA said the agency was aware of some advanced driver assistance systems that have not responded appropriately when emergency flashing lights were present under certain circumstances. Wow. I mean, the story, we talk about autonomous driving a lot. There's been a ton of progress that's been made on the technology. We know that tons of trials, a lot of QA happening by a lot of different companies. But to see this take place in some of these tests is really interesting and kind of maybe raises some red flags, I would think, for some people. Jeff, what did you think about this?
I hope it raises some red flags. Man, if you can't, avert sirens and spinning lights, that's an issue to the autonomous driving technology. What I think this really shows, we've talked about autonomous planes, vehicles, semis, everything in terms of where it's at. And obviously some people are just ready to get on board right now. I've always been a little bit more hesitant. I think some of those projections for having autonomous vehicles within the next 5 years are very ambitious. And I think that is what this illustrates. This, even when you look on Tesla's website, Elon Musk, who is the biggest proponent of driverless vehicles, and his autopilot, it's talking about being a driver assistance technology. And that is where we are. Mm-hmm. It is there to be an assist, not to take over, not to let you take a nap. Don't start playing on your phone. It's there so if you need to, just relax a little bit while the vehicle's on the road, it can do that, but you still need to be aware and in charge of the vehicle. And I think that's what this is showing for right now. I think what the real key is, we still have these vehicles that are understanding how to use LiDAR, understanding the environments that they're operating in, and we have the mechanisms to collect so much operational data, all the different sensors, all the software that's out there. Give it some time. Let it implement that data that it's capturing with the technology that we have that is autonomously focused, and then we're going to be ready, because that's when artificial intelligence comes into play. That's what it's all about, that machine learning dynamics where it can take that information about somebody's approaching an accident scene. What do? Well, they slow down. Mm-hmm. They veer away from these lights, whatever the case may be. That's how we're going to get there. We're obviously not there yet. Don't rush the technology. Let it happen. Let's use what we have to develop better ways of going to market with this. And don't give people false pretenses or false confidence on what this is really about, especially in the name.
What name?
Like autopilot.
Oh.
Self-driving car.
Self-driving.
Yeah. So let's be smarter when we roll this stuff out, because it's obviously not ready at the extent that we want yet.
Yeah, I agree. Nolan, did you find the study to be emphatic in its conclusions, or do you think this is just a starting point? Like, where are you at on this?
I think it's a good starting point, figuring out why these vehicles have issues with the emergency lights. I mean, probably needs further testing because, as you read, it didn't use an actual car.
Correct.
It was the term aftermarket something.
Yeah, they were, I think, basically dash cams that had driver assist features. And because Tesla doesn't use LiDAR, they use cameras for their autonomous vehicles, like a series of cameras. So I think that was the point here, was that they were similar to how a Tesla would operate that system. Again, how do we know how similar? I don't think even the researchers know that, but
I think like the best outcome would be it sparks some sort of collaboration between automakers and regulators regarding like autonomous vehicles and these issues, and maybe better inform drivers, because they, as we just talked about, seem to think that these cars are in Back to the Future 2 when they were just doing anything else but driving.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And the regulatory framework at this point is basically like, well, we'll get to it later. Well, and, none of this is market ready, really. So we'll get to it later. But it's complex.
Except the vehicle makers think it is ready right now.
Right.
So that's the problem.
Well, I agree. That's the problem. And, Jeff, you said it well. I agree that, it's the problem is generally not autonomous technology. It's more so the perception of how these systems function. And that is going to come down to every single individual driver and what they perceive as being, when they can take their hands off the wheel or whatever. Yeah. We've seen that be a big problem over the years, especially with, how I feel about the term autopilot. I think you do as well. It's just, it's a misrepresentation of what this technology does. There's 5 or 6 tiers of autonomous driving, and Tesla's somewhere around tier 2. I think it goes up to 5 or 6 being fully autonomous. We're not even close to fully autonomous. Right. This thing should not be called autopilot, but anyway, it seems like, it's this big race to get to market with all these features and abilities. I think you can kind of understand why consumers don't really understand the differences between all the technology that's out there. And the fact that you can buy these aftermarket devices off the shelf from Amazon.com and plug them in, and they have these features that are driver assist. That's a little bit scary.
That's an issue.
Yeah, I know. It's concerning to me as well.
I'd agree.
All right. Our third most popular story this week, the Biden administration will loan $6.6 billion to Rivian to build a Georgia factory that the automaker had previously paused. The Biden administration has announced a DOE loan of $6.6 billion to Rivian to build a factory in Georgia that had stalled as the startup automaker struggled to become profitable. It's unclear whether the administration can complete the loan before Donald Trump becomes president again, or whether the Trump administration might try to claw the money back. Rivian made a splash when it went public and began producing large electric R1 SUVs, pickup trucks, and delivery vans at a factory in Normal, Illinois in 2021. Months later, the company announced it would build a $5 billion plant about 40 miles east of Atlanta to build the R2, a smaller, more affordable SUV. But Rivian was unable to meet production and sales targets and rapidly burned through cash. Heard that before. In March, the company said it would pause construction of the Georgia plant. Since then, Volkswagen said it would invest $5 billion in Rivian in a joint venture. The money eased Rivian's cash crunch, and now the company says its plans to make the R2 and the smaller R3 in Georgia are back on. The money would come from the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Loan Program, which has $17.7 billion to provide low-cost loans to make fuel-efficient vehicles and components. The program requires a reasonable prospect of repayment of the loan. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp may have mixed feelings. He says his goal is to make Georgia a center of the electric vehicle industry, but has long claimed that manufacturers were picking Georgia before Biden's signature climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act, was passed. Still, this loan could rescue one of Kemp's projects, putting him in the position of potentially defending the loan if Trump tries to quash it. State and local governments offered Rivian an incentive package worth an estimated $1.5 billion in 2022. The deadline for the company to complete its investment and hiring under that deal was extended to 2030. The land purchase, clearing, and grading have been completed, as has much of the road work. Nolan, do you think that this is going to work?
Well, I don't know if I have the background to make an educated guess like that, but I am interested to see how it'll play out. With I was intrigued by the section of the article where it talks about the Governor Kemp, who, fun fact, used to govern me when I lived in Georgia.
Your old governor.
Yeah, right. In 2023, he said he wanted to make Georgia the electric mobility capital of the country. But then there was a quote in there, his spokesperson said that he opposes federal involvement that puts Georgia-based automakers at a disadvantage. So I'm curious to see how this affects state and federal collaboration when it comes to clean energy goals. If the loan stays and the factory success is a success, does he suddenly enjoy this federal help? Or if the loan gets stopped and construction remains paused, and then what does he say? Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, he seems to, have been pretty vocal about his position, which is, I've had this under control. I don't need your help. However,
if this works, I don't think you're going to see him trying to hand that money back anytime soon. Jeff, what did you think about this loan? Do you think that this is a good idea? Do you think that there are some concerns that we should have with this amount of money?
I didn't like it at all. I think it's a bad call. I think it's politically motivated. I think we see Elon Musk up there with Donald Trump, him having a more prominent role in this administration going forward. And I think this was a bit of a jab, getting at a Tesla competitor potentially here. I think the amount of money is kind of startling. When you look at what they're giving Rivian, it's a loan, I understand that, with basically like, we hope you pay us back, kind of a dynamic attached to it. So there's not a ton of pressure on Rivian there. In the past, when these loans were distributed, yes, Tesla got one for about $500 million, so quite a bit less, and they paid theirs back. Nissan has also been recipients of these types of monies. They've paid theirs back. The only one that's sort of equivalent to this is Ford got just under $6 billion that was used over a number of different factories. So to me, a lot of this money was sort of earmarked for technology and advancing the technology of electric vehicles through known entities. Yes, you can say Tesla was not a known entity at the time, but again, they made good on the loan and they paid it back.
Our second most popular story this week, Cargill to cut 8,000 jobs. Another multinational company, another pledge towards streamlining. Cargill has revealed that it plans to cut 5% of its global workforce in the coming year, a move that will result in the elimination of some 8,000 jobs. According to Reuters, Cargill, a food company with a heavy footprint in trading and distributing grains and other commodities, has seen prices for wheat, corn, and soybeans drop to a 4-year low, resulting in shrinking margins. The largest privately held company in the United States, Cargill released earnings reports that reflected that decline, with revenue falling from $177 billion in fiscal year 23 to $160 billion in 2024. Earlier this year, Bloomberg revealed that the company's profits had fallen to $2.48 billion from a high of $6.7 billion in 2022. Job cuts, according to a memo issued by CEO Brian Sykes, mean to target structural inefficiencies by removing layers, expanding the scope and responsibilities of our managers, and reducing duplication of work. Reports say the job reductions won't impact the company's executive team, but will affect a number of next-level senior leaders. All right, who wants to take the first crack at this one? Not a very positive story. Jeff?
Yeah, it's interesting. First of all, I used to be a Cargill employee. For 3 years in the summer, I worked in Cargill cornfields.
No way.
Yeah, helping develop hybrid seeds.
You were a child of the corn?
I was a child of the corn. Yes.
Ooh.
Yes. A pollinator, if you will. It was dirty and very warm, but it was paid pretty well. So, what's interesting here when you look at Cargill, this is a huge number, obviously, of layoffs. And what it kind of looks at when you look at the markets that they're in and where a lot of their issues are coming from a sales and revenue perspective, those may not get better anytime soon. You know, you're talking a little bit about tariffs before. If we start cutting things off in terms of making it more difficult for things coming in from Mexico or sending to Mexico and Canada with retaliatory tariffs there, this could get really tough because we're already looking at products that have real tight margins on them. And if the prices of those products continue to stay so low, Cargill is going to be in a very tough spot going forward. You feel bad for the 8,000 people that lose their jobs. So this is also a company that still made $2 billion last year. 2.5. So there's a balance there. And I think what that means is, to me, is they're a very diverse company, but they're maybe putting too many eggs in some of these baskets. They've got some really interesting subsets of their company. When you look at bioindustrial, that is an area where we see all sorts of interesting things going on right now. You mentioned like last week, that food product that they were basically making from air. Mm-hmm. Crazy stuff like that. Risk management, something pretty much any operational company can use help and support with. And then transportation services. We hear about logistics nightmares, and they've developed some really innovative wind-driven technology for ocean-based transportation. So Cargill does have some other options out here. They've got some money to work with. They're not a destitute company here, a destitute organization. Obviously, when you've got less money coming in, you start looking to see if there are redundancies and you can reduce headcount, which is what they're doing here to meet earnings expectations. But I think there is other opportunities here for them to leverage and take advantage of. They're known as a very innovative company. So take advantage of that and hopefully send more positive messages out to the market to help boost some of those revenue numbers. Because I think they have the assets in-house to do so. Another interesting fact about Cargill, you mentioned they're a privately owned company.
Yeah.
Guess how many billionaires are part of the Cargill McMillan family that owns 88% of Cargill?
How many?
Billionaires. Nolan, you're a trivia guy. How many do you think?
Oh my goodness. Is it less than 10?
No.
Okay.
21 billionaires in this family that controls, I think it's like 88% of Cargill.
What?
Yes. They're doing okay.
So
So that's got to be really tough too when you start looking at 8,000 people losing their job, announcing that right before Christmas. So.
Yeah, no kidding. That's some class warfare written into that script.
Harsh.
Nolan, what do you think? Do you think they're getting this right? Do you think these are they're going to be able to wash out just redundancies, or is it going to cut a little bit here?
So, I mean, the story kind of hit close to home, not in the same sense that's hitting these impacted workers, but the part I saw first, towards the end of the article, is it said it won't impact the executive team. And I thought that kind of added to the debate regarding fairness around corporate restructuring and where the lower and mid-level employees are hurt, but in the name of saving costs, while the upper level are fine. And it makes me wonder, like, why isn't cost cutting shared across the entire company? Or, I mean, you talk about it can affect the ones that are left behind who are still working there with the increased workload, lower morale, burnout, et cetera. And then, I kind of heard the same song and dance when I was working in Savannah for Gannett, whatever you call it. Mm-hmm. And Gatehouse Media bought it out. And they said there aren't going to be any. There's going to be layoffs, but we're going to do some cost cutting. But it's not. It's just going to be duplicate work. We're not going to hurt the frontline reporters. And then
they cut
2 months later, I was gone. Oh. So I can empathize with these people where it's just like, why is the upper level doing so fine, and I got to be the one that gets hurt by this?
Yeah.
Well, especially when it's universally preserved like that. It should have been. I think we feel a little bit more comfortable when companies say it's across the board in terms of all levels and all positions. I think you're absolutely right when you say they kind of isolated who they're going after here.
Yeah, for sure. And I didn't know the thing about all the billionaires. So
there's money here is my point. I mean,
yeah. And, to think about how, to your point, Nolan, about morale, that's not a great message. I don't think. I think people are going to notice that. One thing I took away from this too, I was reading some follow-up analysis on this story, and some observers are trying to point to a silver lining here, which is that the potential that grocery prices might be heading towards a downward trend. A recent report had pointed to how inflation, along with the war in Ukraine, had drove prices up for that couple year period. You look at that 2022 number on profits, 6.7 billion compared to last year, 2.5. And so they're saying that as grocery prices have declined and the U.S. cattle supply shrinks, which is a big issue for Cargill as well, the company's profits have taken a hit. It's still hard for me to defend that a little bit because it sounds like all these external pressures, but somehow the company managed to be triply profitable during those years, like almost like benefiting immensely from a war and an economic crisis in terms of their profits. So strange how that happens in those very tough times where they had to raise their prices, that they made, such high record profit levels. But, sometimes that happens through no fault of your own if you're Cargill. Interesting to see what happens next. I mean, I think the idea is, will consumers... Is this a good sign for consumers, actually? The fact that Cargill is saying, like, we need to tighten our belts a little bit because prices are going down to the point where we can't absorb that. So interesting to see if that does happen.
Yeah.
All right. So our number one story this week is about an explosion at a GM site that caused damages to homes in the area. So a tank used for storing an oil and brine solution exploded at General Motors' Milford Proving Ground in Michigan last week, an incident that reportedly damaged 2 nearby homes but caused no injuries. Brighton Fire Authority Chief Michael O'Brien stated that the explosion occurred in a leased section of the proving ground, which houses multiple wells and tanks for crude oil production and crude oil brine and natural gas storage. One tank reportedly suffered a catastrophic failure leading to an explosion. Texas-based White Rock Oil and Gas owns and operates the affected tank, but had begun the process to transfer ownership to Colorado-based T2 Operating Corp. Fire crews responded to the explosion and contained the fire in less than an hour using foam and water that the trucks supplied, as the area lacked fire hydrants. According to O'Brien, residents up to 6 miles away felt the explosion. Still, the incident only caused damages to homes located approximately 200 feet from the site. Groundwater and drinking water supplies were thought to be unaffected. GM said that it would investigate the cause along with state and fire officials and the well owner. Nolan, you put this story together for us last week. What did you think about this situation for GM?
I was intrigued by the part of the story where they said the tank was between a transfer of ownership. Mm-hmm. And I thought that kind of put an emphasis on that whole process, especially in this kind of sector. We were dealing with things that can explode. And it's under investigation, so we don't know the cause, but it kind of raises uncertainties about maintenance, oversight, and accountability when it's going through a change of ownership. And then I thought they were just very lucky. I mean, I've never seen one of these explosions in person, but they felt it 6 miles away, and the only damage was the tank and homes 200 feet away. So that seems incredibly lucky. And
yes,
hopefully everyone was doing their jobs, even though they were handing it off to some other company.
Yeah, no, I mean, great point. But yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought about that. So do you think that maybe some things are getting missed as this transition is underway?
Yeah, I was like, I thought you were doing that. I thought you were making sure it wasn't going to explode.
Yeah,
I was supposed to do that? Oh, oops.
That guy, we already transferred that guy back. He was supposed to do it. He's not here anymore. It's a good question to ask, I think. Yeah. Jeff, what did you think about this story in Michigan?
Well, two things that hit me. First of all, this Milford Proving Ground. I mean, this is a historical sort of site, I guess you could say. I mean, this is 100-year-old proving grounds. I mean, all of the history, if you're a Ford guy, if you're a car guy, really, I mean, there is a ton of history that you can take away from everything that's been done here in these proving grounds. Very cool. So with that in mind, I guess I was surprised to see that they were leasing grounds for oil wells. And when you look and dig into it a little bit and numbers on the internet, and plus I'm not the numbers guy, we're missing our math expertise. So I don't want to
Matt Damon is not.
I don't want to dive too deeply into the numbers here without David, but the amount of money that GM is actually getting from leasing out this land for these wells and everything else, it's, to be generous, let's put it in the upper like not less than $10,000 a month is what they're probably generating from these wells. If that's the case, why?
Why take the risk?
Why? Yeah. Why put that in the middle of proving grounds that, number one, you need for your R&D work. Number two, you've got $50,000, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 vehicles zooming around these roads. You've got people right there as well. You've got 100 buildings on this facility. What are we doing here? I mean, I get wanting to take advantage of natural resources. I'm not opposed to that. But again, I think it may be time to reevaluate the need to have these wells and this type of operation on a very important research and development area of your company. That was the biggest thing that I took away from it, I guess.
Jeff, you just told Cargill to diversify.
I did.
You don't want GM to do the same?
I think you got to weigh the risk and rewards here. And I understand this is the first one. And thankfully, again, nobody got hurt.
Right, yeah.
But I wonder how much GM was really focused on the fact that, like you said, Nolan, this was transferring. There's a transfer of ownership here. Things can drop all the time. Meanwhile, this is a huge asset for you and your company and what it needs to do on a day-to-day basis. So, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't really seem like it's worth it in the long run.
Maybe don't take it quite this far.
Yeah.
So I got a little confused for a second when I was writing this up because I didn't realize right away that there were actually 2 explosions at 2 separate GM plants last week. There was one at the GM Hamtramck assembly plant where a worker was injured. So it was kind of a rough week for GM.
They're on fire.
They're literally.
You're welcome.
I was trying for one, but you got there first. Well done.
Well,
just watch and learn, Nolan.
Yeah,
You'll get there.
It'll come with time.
You'll get there. I've only got about 198 of these on you.
It's true.
7, whatever.
The other thing that we saw this week from GM is that they announced that they were taking $5 billion in charges on some failed efforts with their China business. Yeah. They also expanded a recall this week over truck tailgates that could open unexpectedly. So, yeah, it was kind of like, man, they had a pretty good year, I would say, comparatively, if you compare them to their peers. But GM does not appear to be ending 2024 on a high note. So they're probably happy to, close the doors for a couple days.
Can we just shut it down for a little bit?
Let's just have some eggnog and hit the reset button, as I say to my kids. Hit the hands in, hit the reset button.
I like that one. That's pretty good.
We have to hit the reset button a lot.
Yeah.
It's a well-used button. All right. Well, before we move on to our In Case You Missed It, which is where we talk about stories that maybe got not a lot of eyeballs, but still are making an impact or are interesting to us in some way. Before we do that, we're going to hear again from our sponsor, Stay Sharp with Razor Leaf.
Digital transformation is reshaping manufacturing, and leaders must keep up with a rapidly changing technology landscape. Razorleaf, a global consulting and systems integration firm, launched Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, a podcast covering digital thread, digital twins, PLM, MES, data integration, and more. Whether you're a seasoned professional or new to digital transformation, this podcast will help you stay ahead of the trends. You can find Stay Sharp with Razorleaf on all major podcast platforms. Tune in today.
All right. Let's move on with our In Case You Missed It segment. Of course, this is, chock full of great stories that our readers totally blew reading. So try harder next week, guys. Nolan, let's start with you.
Oh, okay. I was expecting to go last, but I can go first. So my In Case You Missed It is a nice shameless plug of my Gen Z manufacturing series. We had the most latest episode come out last week, and the headline was Apprenticeships Need to Do More Than Just Pay for School. So I interviewed a young lady named Chloe Doherty. She's 22 years old. She's an Industry 4.0 Tech Center engineer for a machinery manufacturer called Zoller Inc. She was actually recommended to me by a previous guest on Gen Z manufacturing, Aaliyah Schulke of Anka, and I met Chloe at IMTS and asked her, hey, you want to be on the show? And she said, sure.
Awesome.
So we spent a lot of time talking about her apprenticeship with Zoller, and she said the big reason she decided to do it was because they were going to pay for her schooling, which I think is a reason a lot of people decided to take that route. And she said she really enjoyed it because Zoller treated her as an equal instead of a student, and it made her feel okay about making mistakes. And I thought that raised the point of like, yes, paying for school is great, but like the job doesn't end there. You still have to train them and make them feel confident in a new career that they're hoping that they do the rest of their lives. She said she knows people that are in bad apprenticeships and that they're just waiting out their contractual obligations so they don't have to pay back their tuition.
Oh.
They hate it so much, but they're in too deep at this point. And added that some of these apprenticeships make the students feel terrible at making the smallest mistake when no one was even there to catch it.
Interesting.
So I thought that added a little depth to the whole argument of should you do the apprenticeship? Should you go to school? Should you do vocational? Stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would say that for anyone listening, if you haven't checked this out, so Nolan hosts this podcast that is just completely dedicated to helping the industrial manufacturing business leaders understand how to relate to Gen Z, what issues are important to them. We hear it so often from people when we look for feedback of how are you handling the labor crisis? And so many of them say they are trying to appeal to the younger generation and they're struggling to do that. So I would say definitely check out this podcast if you can. And you get to see Nolan. So
I am there.
Yeah. Jeff, what do you think about Nolan's Gen Z episode this week?
No, he does a great job. It definitely would recommend checking it out. Nolan does do a great job on it, regardless of what we say behind his back.
Yeah.
So the couple things that jumped out at me, first of all, when you talk about it has to be okay to make mistakes and learning from those mistakes. That's something that has been part of management culture or best practices forever. And it's kind of amazing that's still something that is lacking in a lot of organizations. I think the other thing that really brings up too is the cultural dynamic there. If people are just basically just waiting to the day where they are free of their commitment of a company, obviously that company is going to have bigger issues retaining and retracting more workers, which bleeds into all this stuff we talk about with the skills gap. It all comes back to, we talk about this with safety, we talk about this with cybersecurity, we talk about this with so many things. It is the culture of that company, which in a manufacturing environment is so easy to overlook because you're focused on, let's get the product out the door and meet our responsibilities that way. But for those companies that take that extra time to establish a culture where you trust your employees, you empower your employees, goes a long way, solves a lot of these issues. Yeah.
Yeah. You hear that expression sometimes, like, instead of figuring out how you're going to recruit more workers, you have to figure out why the ones that you do have are leaving.
Yeah.
And I think that is true, but also in manufacturing, there's this dynamic of just demographics, right? Like there's nothing that you can do about the fact that you have a workforce that's 55 and above. And, how many of those workers are walking out the door every day to retirement. Yeah. So you have to figure out how to balance those two things. And I think it's important to actually listen to what people in that generation have to say and take it seriously instead of saying like, oh, it's easy to to sit in your experience and say that you know better, but to really listen,
True.
Yeah. All right, Jeff, what was your In Case You Missed It this week?
So, I mean, we haven't talked at all about supply chain or tariffs, so I thought I'd pick a story there. The one that I picked was China is banning exports to the U.S. of gallium, germanium, antimony in response to chip sanctions. So basically, China announced that it's banning exports to the U.S. of those minerals with potential that they have potential military and automotive applications. They're lashing back at the U.S., placing limits on semiconductor-related exports. I wanted to talk about this a lot. Actually, I want to bring up, too, a quote here from China's foreign ministry. It said China has lodged stern protests with the U.S. for its update of the semiconductor export control measures, sanctions against Chinese companies, and malicious suppression of China's technological progress. Now, that's not new, okay? We've talked about that a lot. But when we talk about these tariffs, which we're going to have actually a report that we post to the website this week, that the podcast comes out, with a lot of experts weighing in on what could potentially happen with these tariffs. Because a lot of people don't know. There's a lot of speculation in terms of what President-elect Trump is going to do, how that's going to affect prices, how that's going to affect trade, supply chains, and everything else. And I think what this story underscored to me is there's so many moving pieces to this that we just don't think about, may not consider, but are going to impact things on a day-to-day basis. These particular minerals, yes, we use them in different materials, but we use them for automotive batteries now, electric batteries. You can see that they've spelled out the military applications and some of these reprisals from other countries. We were just talking about Cargill and some of the prices for agricultural products. If we jack tariffs up on stuff coming from Mexico and Canada, they're going to do the same thing to us when we want to export some of those other products. So to what extent is all of this stuff going to take place? What can we anticipate? We don't know yet. Mm-hmm. And it's I think everybody, what this illustrated to me is just this waiting game that everybody is playing right now to see how far are you going to go, President Trump? How far is China going to go? Can we send stuff to Vietnam instead? What's going to happen there? What's going to happen with the free trade agreement in North America? All of those different variables. And I think it's important right now for everybody to get as much multifaceted information as possible so that you're prepared. Everybody has their political leanings and personal opinions. That isn't going to matter. What's going to matter is the reality of the situation and being prepared for all of the different scenarios that could play out. This is one of them. If China starts jacking up the prices or the availability of these minerals, you need to have supply chain redundancies in place. Mm-hmm. So this one just underscored this much bigger, very complicated topic. Yeah. But I think it's an illustration of this is the stuff we got to be looking at and you have to be ready for.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, there's been a lot of tit for tat for years, especially with China. It's not just like getting ahead of potential concerns with these tariffs. There's already a lot, with these entity lists that are happening now, making it harder for Chinese-owned businesses to do business with American companies. But my point is that there is a lot of air in this balloon, right? Mm-hmm. Just heading into what could be very dramatic, position from the Trump administration. On top of that, it could be a very extreme consequence to pricing and to our supply chains. And I agree. I think people have to be ready for this. I was very surprised when I saw this story break, how little attention it got.
Yeah, and typically anything with China does get a lot of attention, rightfully so. I mean, there's just so many inroads and so many connection points with anything coming into or out of China. And this one's a big one. These particular minerals, this should hit home because this affects so many different industries.
Yeah.
Well, I see people on X, Twitter, whatever you call it, they're saying, "Oh, we'll just get our own." From where? Mm-hmm. I don't think there's that many deposits. I was looking up on United States Geological Survey. There's like one germanium site in the U.S., 3 in gallium, a couple of antimony. So just
well, and that's the other part of this. We've talked about this too with the rare earths that are needed for automotive batteries, electric vehicle batteries. We might be able to find it here, but then that's creating a whole new infrastructure, an industry that we tried to shut down because it was so toxic. Mm-hmm. So that creates new potential conversations, whatever you want to say, in terms of how we're going to address that. And that's one of the interesting things. And again, I'm going to be putting together, there was an interview with just like 5 different experts on supply chain and tariffs. And one of the arguments that was made is this will force the U.S. to provide its own infrastructure and we'll need to make investment and it will boost manufacturing. But in the meantime, how long are we willing to go and put up with some of the pain that is going to cause from a cost perspective, from a pricing perspective, and from an availability perspective? So there's so many different parts of this that we just don't know about and how they're going to affect. Everything is so interconnected and it affects things so much because of the global nature of our economy.
Yeah.
That it's going to be very interesting. We'll be talking more about it.
For sure. And, I think it bears repeating that people are fatigued already of price increases and inflation and, kind of these synthetic impacts to the access and pricing on the goods that they use every single day. And I don't think, you ask how long we'll last. I don't think long. I don't think we're lasting now. People are very, very much struggling in many ways since the pandemic. That's quite a few years. People, I think, are very, they're over it. Yeah. All right. So, Maya, in case you missed it this week, I selected a story about Coca-Cola changing its plastic pledge, excuse me, and the response from some environmental groups to that. So in 2023, Coca-Cola was named the top plastic polluter in the world for the 6th straight year. They say that is based on a study of the most commonly discarded plastic items that are found in public places like parks or beaches. Coca-Cola has had some ambitious plastic recycling and reduction efforts underway. They announced this week that they will scale back their efforts, and environmental groups are not happy. So Coca-Cola has modified these voluntary goals. The company had previously set out to use 50% recycled plastic materials in its product by 2030. Now it says it will use 35 to 40% and not until 2035. Additionally, Coke has modified a goal around recycling. Originally, the company said it would recycle the plastic equivalent of every bottle it put out into the world. Now, the company says it will ensure the collection of 70% to 75% of bottles and cans entering the market every year without naming any sort of specific timeline for that. The environmental group Oceana blasted Coca-Cola for its, quote, short-sighted, irresponsible change, with Senior VP of Strategic Initiatives Matt Littlejohn adding that it won't make a dent in the company's overall plastic use. Meanwhile, the organization Break Free from Plastic called the latest move a master class in greenwashing. Very harsh words from these organizations about Coca-Cola's change. It was interesting absorbing the two sides of this. I think there's a little bit of nuance that needs to be considered in the fact that I don't know how hard or not Coca-Cola is working at trying to push back against its history and its characterization of being this plastic polluter. But I think even if they really, really want to do this, they do have to balance the needs of their buyers. And we know plastic is the cheapest to source. It is the lightest to ship. It's the least prone to breakage. And right now, as we were just talking about, consumers have made it abundantly clear that costs at the grocery store are very important to them and getting those costs down. Yeah. So if that really matters to your customer base, then I think it's a tough place to be if you're Coca-Cola to try to serve those two objectives. That said, I also feel like companies might be seeing a window here. There's like a lot of divisive rhetoric. Our country is clearly deeply divided in terms of how we feel about, what is the best path forward for politics, for our planet. Like there's just a lot happening there. People don't agree. I think there's maybe only so much outrage that the populace can take potentially at once. It's possible that they thought, let's do this now. We'll sneak it into the news cycle. It'll get buried. There's so much going on with the new administration transition, the holidays, and then by the time it's gone from the news cycle, then we have a new administration that maybe doesn't care as much about sustainability initiatives. So that's just the cynical side of me when I read this, thinking like, oh, maybe Coca-Cola saw this as an opportunity to take some of the work out, and maybe a good time to announce that. But I don't know how you guys felt about that.
I think sooner is always better for these types of announcements. So whether the timing was strategic or not, better now than later, I guess. Or maybe they knew it sooner and they could have come out with it. I think the one thing that I would take away from on a positive note from this is the amount of transparency that's coming forward in a lot of these announcements. yes, they missed their goal, but at least they're not trying to say, we tried. We're actually doing this after the fact. They are getting out ahead of it a little bit and saying, we want it to be here. This is where we're going to end up being. And I think it also puts an onus on continuing to push these types of recycling technologies forward. We are not good at it yet. We have to get a lot better at recycling plastic. I think the public knowledge is out there. I think in general, not everybody takes it to heart, but the knowledge is out there in terms of, being smarter with water bottles. My kids, they're amazing in terms of how they refill their water bottles instead of using plastic. Mm-hmm. And that's rubbed off on my wife and I. We use reusable sandwich bags as opposed to the plastic ones that are the disposable ones. So even though these organizations were very frustrated, and I can appreciate where they're coming from, overall, there have been some pretty major steps forward that have been taken. But I think this continues to put pressure on the companies to continue to have to get better. And I think that's to me, it's a bigger picture takeaway, I guess, than right now.
Glass half full from Jeff.
Trying to be, yeah.
What did you think, Nolan?
Is there any chance that this was the first of many reductions? When you're at the airport, 15-minute delay, another 15-minute delay, when all the while they knew it was going to be a 2-hour delay?
That does happen.
Is it going to stop at 35 to 40%?
That does happen a lot. I just...
Why so negative, Nolan?
Hey,
Jeez.
I just, to me, it was like, it just came on the backs too of all these companies that are like, you know what, we're not doing DEI anymore. Yeah. We tried it, it's not working. It didn't work. We're not going to try anymore. And to me, it just, the timing of all of that just feels very convenient to me. Like, hey, let's just real quick get out from underneath this. Yeah. It's a challenge and we don't want to have to deal with it.
You're suspicious of Coke. I'm suspicious of the Biden administration.
Yeah.
We're just, boy.
Just like
there's not a lot of holiday spirit flowing through here.
No, Scrooge 1 and 2 over here. Nolan, brighten up the panel a little bit.
I liked your use of the word rage in the headline. I thought that was well done. Activist rage.
Well, they did all seem very angry. Maybe that was editorializing, but I mean, slightly, because the masterclass in greenwashing, that's short-sighted, irresponsible. They are
an eloquent bunch.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see what happens. I'll suspend my disbelief and I'll give it a couple years. We'll get back.
We'll follow up.
What are you guys doing? December 5th, 2027 at
put it on my calendar.
3:30 p.m. Central Time.
We'll do it.
We'll just circle back on this. Yeah. Okay, sounds good. All right.
I may need to push it back a couple years.
Before we get out of here, let's pop over to Nolan for a quick final thought.
Okay. So last week was Thanksgiving, and ever since I graduated from high school in Texas, I may have done like one Thanksgiving with the family since then, and co-host Jeff was kind enough to invite me into his home the day before. So I did Thanksgiving with Rinky and friends.
Whoa.
Yes.
Okay. Tell me, Nolan, what was the weirdest thing about Jeff's Thanksgiving?
I don't want this is going to sound bad, but he cooked everything.
Wow.
I did.
Everything.
How good was it?
It was amazing. So were the leftovers.
Yeah. Send them home.
I'm not going to say I didn't expect you to be a solid chef, but everything. But I thought it just raised, when I was in college, I didn't go home and friends would invite me to their place. And then, when I was in Minnesota living by myself, coworkers would invite me to their place. I think it's nice when people take in the strays because, when we had 4 days off, and that's not, I love the time off, but it just isn't enough time to go all the way to Texas for Thanksgiving. So it is nice when people are generous and bring in non-family members.
Yeah. Jeff is very nice. I agree.
I agree.
I too agree that I am nice.
And he is, no, it was great to have you, Nolan. Glad you could make it. Yeah, it was, I love cooking those big meals. To me, that's very enjoyable. And my wife, God bless her, she does a lot of the cleanup afterwards, a lot of the dishes and stuff. I had to dry some things, but otherwise I got to catch up on football while she was cleaning up the kitchen. So we know our roles, I guess you could say. But the 21.5 pound turkey, I overcooked it a little bit. But otherwise, I thought it was pretty solid.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, see?
Yeah, we had a Thanksgiving that was a vegetarian, 2 gluten-free, like 2 celiacs people, and a dairy-free person. And my mom cooked everything also. And I was like, Mom, please, like, can I do anything? And she was like, a fruit tray? Like, so.
Well, once you get in there
Yeah.
and you figure out how to kind of schedule it,
Yeah.
it is almost easier to do it yourself. I mean, there are people helping me. My wife helped me out with other stuff too. But yeah, it's just kind of getting into the mode. And
Yeah,
Is-
she
is
definitely
there-
had her.
Is there a greater tension than kitchen tension? It's like, oh, you do it that way. Okay.
What? Okay. Yep.
I think the true test of my marriage was when we washed windows. And because one person's on the inside, one
Yeah.
person's on the outside, and we did not get into screaming matches about whose side it was on to clean it off.
Yeah.
Because that I have seen deteriorate quickly.
This is a good question.
I mean, I think that is the big one. If you can get through that and you're still civil and talking, that was a good test for us, I think.
Like, oh, that's where you put the bowls. Not where I would have put them, but it's like,
One time we had a plumbing problem where I think it was something was happening, like our bathtub was not draining or something. And we realized there was a clog. We were in the basement together. This was like almost divorce.
whoa.
My husband had poured a bunch of Drano down the drain, and then he's like, we were like holding onto it, and he couldn't get it to go down, so he was gonna pull the pipe apart. And then I like was not prepared for the fact that Drano was gonna fly into my face. I don't think he was planning on that, but I was not happy.
Oof.
It was a big mistake. But you know what? We survived it. And I'll never do any plumbing again. Also have no skills in that area, so I should not have been there in the first place. Jeff, what's your final thought this week?
So I was going to mention the Thanksgiving dinner. It was great having Nolan there. It was a lot of fun to cook. We also had some trivia that happened way back before
It's been a hot
break.
That's right.
So just to refresh everybody's memory, the first one was a true or false question. Is that is the wrong one. Oh yeah. What should you do with a swollen food can?
Mm-hmm.
And David had it correctly, but just throw it out. I think you said you should open it first.
Well, I
Yeah.
didn't want to pick the same thing
Yeah.
David picked, but
And
I'm not going to open it.
You puncture
And
with
then
a
the other one
knife,
was a
so-
true or false question.
Eat it.
It's if someone was poisoned,
Mhm.
if you should make them throw it up. And you were correct, Anna. So we did have a listener get that correct.
Okay.
And so we'll be sending them a prize package of all sorts of Today in Manufacturing swag.
Yes.
So congratulations, Eric. It is coming your way. And seeing as how it was kind of fun, I thought we'd do it again.
Let's do it again. So Nolan and I
Hollywood-
both answer?
So these are both open-ended.
Okay.
So you'll
Uh-oh.
each get one.
Oh, no.
Okay.
Oh, boy.
So again, this first one, you're agreeing or disagreeing with Anna's response. Remember, these cards are from 1986.
Up to date.
Up to date.
Anna, name 2 effective steps in putting out a grease fire in a cooking pan. Grease fire in a cooking pan. 2 things to put it out.
Take away the air. Like,
Okay.
And smother it with like baking soda or flour or something. Is that not flour? Yeah. Baking soda.
I feel like I need to tell you that for your own safety. Do not use flour. Okay.
Like I'm gonna like a pan's on fire and I'm gonna like of course I'm just gonna start screaming and make somebody else.
Well, is that your other effective process?
Yeah.
Smother it and scream.
smother and scream?
Okay, so agree or
Run out
disagree
of the
with
house.
Anna.
Grab my children and run out of the house and then
And then
hide.
scream.
I don't.
Okay, so you can agree or disagree with Anna's answer. Let us know.
I think the baking soda thing is, I mean, that was the first thing that popped into my mind. Is that still true? I thought that was like the
We can discuss
age-old way.
after the podcast. But for
Wait.
right now, agree or disagree with Anna's approaches to
Was kill the
Smothering it?
air.
Yeah, and then I think
taking cover, basically.
Pour water on it is.
Oh, uh-oh.
Just kidding.
Stop, drop, and roll.
Okay. All right, Nolan.
Oh,
Let's see if people are going to agree or disagree with your answer to
No.
how can hors d'oeuvres be dangerous? Now, remember,
Choking?
that is per this card from 1986.
So many ways.
So what is the main way? What is the number one way? that hors d'oeuvres can be a safety hazard.
I'll go with choking. Final answer.
They're going to choke on the hors d'oeuvre itself.
Yeah.
Okay. Agree or disagree with Nolan? Let us know, and we'll go from there. We'll see what happens with trivia next week. Ooh, very intriguing.
Well, thanks for those really tough questions. I'm going to go home and study safety all week so I don't look like an idiot.
Well, at least we know your kids will not be anywhere near the explosion that happens when you throw flour on your grease fire.
I was just thinking, like, you put like a powder, and then I think I was trying to think of baking soda. And anyway,
I think that one might be right.
Flour?
No, the baking soda one. Water and flour.
Water and flour.
And if you can combine them,
some bread.
Even better.
Yeah.
Use the heat to make some bread.
A fire extinguisher in play, can use that.
Delightful meal. All right. On that note, we will be getting out of your hair. Thanks for joining us this week. Make sure to like, subscribe to, and share the podcast. Email us at Jeff, Anna, or Nolan at IN.com. You could also email David and ask him why he's not here.
Throw him some math problems. He's really good at them.
Yeah. Tell him to show his work. With email the podcast in the subject line, or show your work in the subject line if you're reaching out to David. You can subscribe to our daily or weekly newsletters on our website. You can find us on YouTube. Please do if you haven't yet. For Jeff and Nolan, I'm Anna Wells. Thanks for joining us. This is the Today in Manufacturing podcast.